You have heard that the mess in Afghanistan was caused by Ronald Reagan because Ronald Reagan armed and funded the Mujahideen. Ronald Reagan gave weapons and money to the Mujahideen because he wanted to use the Mujahideen to get the Soviet Union out of Afghanistan. And it's true that Ronald Reagan caused the big mess, but he's not the only one who caused the big mess because Jimmy Carter was also arming and funding the Mujahideen. Jimmy Carter was also giving weapons and money to the Mujahideen. And in fact, it was Jimmy Carter who started it. So in Afghanistan, there was a king who was overthrown by his brother-in-law, and the brother-in-law took over, but he was soon murdered, and the communists took over in Afghanistan. There were actually two different Marxist parties, but one of them took over, and there was a communist government, a secular government with women's rights and land redistribution, also very oppressive and tyrannical, and did kill a lot of people. Now, President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, wanted to overthrow the government of Afghanistan, so Jimmy Carter did Operation Cyclone, and Jimmy Carter funded and armed anti-government forces in Afghanistan. Jimmy Carter reached out to a bunch of religious radicals, the Mujahideen, and Jimmy Carter gave the Mujahideen weapons and money, and Jimmy Carter armed and funded the Mujahideen, and so the Mujahideen caused a lot of chaos in Afghanistan, and so the Soviet Union intervened in Afghanistan. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. So Jimmy Carter continued funding and arming the Mujahideen. Jimmy Carter continued giving weapons and money to the Mujahideen because now Jimmy Carter wanted to use the Mujahideen to get the Soviet Union out of Afghanistan. And Jimmy Carter lost the election in 1980, so in 1981, Ronald Reagan became the president, and Ronald Reagan continued Jimmy Carter's work. Ronald Reagan continued to fund and arm the Mujahideen. Ronald Reagan continued to give weapons and money to the Mujahideen, and therefore, Operation Cyclone continued. It was Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan who did Operation Cyclone. It was Carter and Reagan who armed and funded the Mujahideen. It was Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan who gave weapons and money to the Mujahideen. So you should correctly criticize and blame Ronald Reagan for what he did in Afghanistan, and you should also be criticizing and blaming Jimmy Carter for what he did in Afghanistan as well, because he also did the same thing. And in fact, Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan did a lot of very similar things. Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan on the policies were not very different. Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan both did a ton of deregulation, and Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan both busted a lot of unions. Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan both destroyed the working class. Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan both listened to big corporations and CEOs and never listened to working people. Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan were both pro-life. They both opposed abortion. They both opposed reproductive rights. Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan were both hardcore evangelicals. Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan both, like, we could go on and on and on and on and on and on and on. Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan were both supportive of Chun Doo-han, and so on and so forth. It's just, stop rehabilitating Jimmy Carter. Just stop it. He is not some dovish little nice guy. He's very hawkish. He was very deregulatory in terms of economic practices, and he was just look at his actual policies before you talk about him, please.